"I will not marry you tomorrow," he said it standing in her drawing room. 36 hours before the wedding, wearing the coat that still carried another woman's perfume. Dorothea Bellgrave looked at the man she had trusted for 5 years and did not weep. She removed her engagement ring. Then go. Rupert Castermere expected tears. What haunted him for years afterward was the fact that she gave him none. If you have ever loved someone who only saw your usefulness, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments. What city are you watching from tonight? The morning of the 36th hour before the wedding began the way most catastrophic mornings do, quietly. Without announcement, with the ordinary sounds of the house that did not yet know what was coming. Dorothea Bellgrave sat at the writing desk in the east parlor of Bellgrave House, London, her dark auburn hair pinned with particular care because the seamstress was due at 10, and there were still 17 items unchecked on the correspondence list she had prepared herself. The wedding breakfast menu required a final confirmation. The rector at St. George's needed the corrected spelling of Rupert's second given name for the marriage register. The coachman for the Calderwick party had written to ask whether His Grace's party should arrive at the church before or after the Bellgrave family carriages. And someone had to answer him, and that someone was Dorothea. Because that had always been Dorothea. There was also a separate leather folder on the corner of her desk. Pale blue ribbon, her own handwriting on the tab, it read, Calderwick Estate Spring Quarter. She had been compiling it for 3 months. Tenant income projections, a revised drainage proposal for the North Fields. A list of 3 banking houses her father considered sound, with notes on their current terms for estate mortgages. A letter she had drafted, but not yet sent to the head of the Agricultural Committee at Calderwick, asking about the condition of the dower cottages. She was not a bride thinking about her gown. She was a woman preparing to run a dukedom. The knock at the parlor door came at 9:30. His Grace the Duke of Calderwick, my lady. Dorothea set down her pen with the automatic composure of someone who had spent 29 years learning that composure was the only currency a woman in her position was permitted to spend freely. She smoothed the front of her morning dress dove gray wool, practical for a working morning, and stood. Send him in. She expected perhaps a question about the church arrangements. She expected at worst nerves. Rupert had always worn his anxiety in small, clipped ways, a tightened jaw, a shorter sentence than usual. She had learned to read those signs and answer them before he voiced them. That was part of what she did, part of what she had always done. Rupert Castermere walked through the door, and she knew immediately. Not from his expression, which was controlled in the way of a man who had rehearsed something painful. Not from the coat, though she registered the coat. The faint, wrong note of a scent that was not his, not her. Not anything that belonged in this room, but from the way he stood. Slightly off-center. The way a man stands when he has already decided something and has arrived only to deliver the verdict. Dorothea Rupert, she did not move from behind the desk. You look as though you have not slept. I haven't. A silence stretched between them. Outside, a cart rumbled past on the street. Inside, the clock on the mantelpiece ticked with the particular indifference of well-made things. Tell me, Dorothea said. I cannot begin a marriage by pretending affection I no longer feel. She had braced without knowing she was bracing. She felt it in her sternum, a tightening, a stillness, the body's instinct to hold itself together before the blow fully registers. How long? He understood immediately what she was asking. She watched it cross his face, the recognition that she already knew the shape of this, even if not the name. 3 months. 3 months. Not a night's recklessness. Not a sudden rush of feeling that had overwhelmed his better judgment in a single unguarded evening. 3 months. While she had been drafting tenant projections and writing to the rector and worrying about the correct spelling of his second given name. 3 months while she had sat across from him at dinner and listened to him speak about Calderwick and truly believed that they were building something. Her name? Dorothea asked. That isn't. Rupert, Lady Sabina Redmayne, she recognized it. Of course she did. A wealthy widow, daughter of an earl. Beautiful in the way that rooms go quiet when a woman enters. Dorothea had met her twice at social occasions and had found her witty, charming, generous with her laughter. She had not, at the time, thought to be afraid of her. And she is aware, Dorothea said carefully. That you are here? Something shifted in Rupert's expression. A flicker of something that was not quite guilt, but lived in the same neighborhood. She is. Dorothea walked to the window. The carriage was black with a crimson interior, parked beneath the gas lamps at the end of the street. A woman sat inside. Even at this distance, even through glass smeared faintly by morning rain, Dorothea could see the color of her dress. She did not move. She simply waited, the way a woman waits when she is very certain of the outcome. You brought her, Dorothea said, while you came to end our engagement. You brought her and you parked her outside my father's house. I did not wish to lie about where I was going. She turned from the window. She looked at him for a long moment, this man she had known for 5 years. This man whose estate she had studied like a second education. This man for whom she had arranged 17 items on a correspondence list this very morning. Truth offered after betrayal is not honesty, Rupert. It is merely confession. He had the grace, at least, to look struck by it. I have spent my life, he said, doing what duty expects. For once I intend to choose what I desire. Yes. Dorothea's voice did not shake. She was intensely proud of that later, in the way one is proud of small survivals. I understand. You have chosen, and I will not argue with the choosing that is yours to make. She crossed to the desk. She picked up the pale blue folder, Calderwick Estate Spring Quarter, and she held it for a moment. 3 months of work, drainage proposals, banking recommendations, a letter to the head of the Agricultural Committee that she had not yet sent. She set it back down on the desk. The ring, she said, and removed it herself. She had worn it for 2 years. It was a good ring, not ostentatious, exactly right for her hand. Chosen with more care than Rupert perhaps realized, because she had dropped a very specific hint to his mother about her preference, and his mother had passed it along. She had been pleased by that. She had thought he listened. She placed it on the desk. Go, she said. Your carriage is waiting. Rupert looked at her. She had the impression he had prepared for something else entirely: tears. Accusation, the kind of scene that would have been, in some uncomfortable way, easier to leave. The absence of it seemed to unsettle him more than any of that would have. Dorothea, go, Rupert. He went. She stood at the window and watched the carriage door open. Watched Rupert climb in, watched it pull away from the curb, and disappear around the corner into the grey London morning. She stood there until it was entirely gone, until the street looked exactly as it had before he arrived. Then she went to the door, turned the key in the lock, sat down on the floor of the east parlor of Bellgrave House, and wept. Not elegantly, not with the restrained dignity she had maintained for every moment he was in the room. She wept the way women weep when no one is watching, without shape, without narrative, without any concern for what she looked like, or what she sounded like, or whether the hairpins she had placed so carefully that morning were coming loose. They were. She couldn't manage them. Her hands were shaking too badly. And after a while she stopped trying. The wedding breakfast menu was still on the desk. The rector still needed his letter. The coachman was still waiting for someone to tell him when to arrive. She sat on the floor of the parlor until she had no weeping left. And then she sat for a while longer, because the world on the other side of the door had not yet rearranged itself into a shape she could navigate. Lord Bellgrave was a man of 61 years who had inherited a marquisate, survived a difficult decade of agricultural depression, buried his wife, raised his daughter largely alone, and developed in consequence the particular Victorian instinct of reaching for legal remedy when emotional remedy was unavailable. He found out within the hour. The veil for the wedding dress was still hanging in the upstairs corridor, pale ivory silk. 12 feet of it, the kind of thing that could not simply be folded away, when Bellgrave came looking for his daughter. We can sue him, he said, before he had fully closed the parlor door behind him. Breach of promise, it's well established. Damages. Public, no, Father, Dorothea. The man has. I will not spend the next year proving before a courtroom full of strangers that a man promised to want me. She was back in her chair by then. The weeping finished, her face composed with the particular flatness that follows real grief. I will not have his letters read aloud in a hall. I will not have my name attached to this for longer than it must be. Bellgrave sat heavily in the chair across the desk. He was a man who had spent his life believing that the right application of social and legal pressure could resolve almost anything. And he was encountering the limits of that belief. Then what? We allow our solicitor to contact his. She had already thought this through. Somewhere in the hour on the floor, the family has incurred direct expenses for the wedding. The flowers, the breakfast, the church arrangement fee, the rooms reserved for out-of-town guests. He will reimburse those costs. And I will accept that as a settlement, and that will be the end of any formal proceeding. That is not justice, no. It is not. Dorothea picked up her pen. But it is dignity. And I find I prefer it. Her father looked at her for a long moment. He was thinking she knew of his wife, of Dorothea's mother, who had been from a branch of a Central European aristocratic family, who had been beautiful and precise, and had a quality about her intelligence that the English drawing rooms of her era had never quite known what to do with. He was thinking that his daughter was, in some fundamental way, her mother's daughter. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll write to the solicitor this afternoon. Thank you, Father." He stood. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, the most he had ever been able to manage by way of physical tenderness. And she had always understood it for what it was. Then he left her alone with the correspondence list and the locked parlor door and the still present knowledge that a woman in crimson had been waiting in a carriage outside her house. London society took exactly 4 days to form its opinion. It was not a unanimous opinion, which was perhaps worse than a unanimous one would have been. A unanimous condemnation of Rupert Castermere would have been clean. A verdict, a sentence, a known quantity. What London society produced instead was a split, the kind of split that leaves the wronged party in the position of having to navigate a room without knowing who in it has already decided she was merely the less exciting option. Roughly a third of the invitations that had arrived for the season simply stopped. They did not decline her, they simply ceased. The hosts found other priorities, other dates, other arrangements. It required no explanation and offered no target. A handful of women she had considered friends became difficult to reach. Letters were answered slowly or not at all. Calls were returned with cards rather than in person. The message was not hostile. It was merely a withdrawal. A quiet redistribution of social proximity. The gossip column that ran on the third day called the Castermere Redmayne attachment a triumph of feeling over arrangement. That was the phrase. A triumph of feeling over arrangement. Dorothea read it at breakfast. She set down the paper. She picked up her coffee. She drank it without speaking, and then excused herself from the table. Later, alone, she let herself understand what the phrase had done. 5 years. 5 years of conversations and plans, and a pale blue folder full of estate projections and tenant welfare notes and banking recommendations. And what the paper had decided, what London's social machinery had generated as its verdict, was that what she and Rupert had built together was merely arrangement. Function, efficiency, the boring necessary infrastructure of aristocratic life. While what he had found with Sabina Redmayne was feeling. As if she had felt nothing. As if the 5 years had been a ledger rather than a life. She held that understanding in her chest for a while. Then she made a decision. She would not disappear. It would have been easy to disappear. Her father had suggested the country estate. Several friends, the ones who had not yet redistributed their proximity, had implied that a period of quiet withdrawal was customary. Expected, perhaps even wise. The world had a place prepared for jilted women. It was somewhere out of sight, where they could process their embarrassment without inconveniencing anyone's dinner party. Dorothea declined the prepared place. She wrote back to every invitation that remained open. She accepted a tea she would rather not have attended, a reception she would find exhausting, and a committee meeting she could have delegated. She dressed with more care than usual, not to impress but to demonstrate to herself as much as anyone else that the architecture of her life was still standing. She went out into London as if London had not already decided what she was. The Relief Committee met on Tuesdays in a building near Southwark that had seen better decades but maintained a certain stubborn dignity of function. Dorothea had been on the committee for 2 years before the engagement ended, and she returned to it 11 days after Rupert walked out of her drawing room. The trustee who greeted her at the door, a round, well-meaning man named Mr. Pemberton, who had known her since she was 23, stopped when he saw her, opened his mouth and arrived at, "My lady, surely you need that is to say we didn't expect good morning, Mr. Pemberton." Dorothea removed her gloves and handed them to the attendant. "Has the coal allocation report come in from the Southwark district?" "Ah, yes." "I believe excellent. I'll need it before the meeting starts." "And the November figures from the Dockworkers' Widows' Fund, are those tabulated yet?" "Ah, yes." "I'll have them, thank you." She moved past him toward the meeting room. At the door she paused, turned back. "I have rested long enough inside other people's opinions. Mr. Pemberton, shall we get to work?" He stared at her for a moment. Then he smiled a small, genuine, slightly astonished smile. "Yes, my lady. Right away." The committee that Tuesday was a different sort of work than seating arrangements and wedding correspondence. It was the work Dorothea had always been drawn toward, even when convention had suggested she ought to direct her energy elsewhere. The work of looking at numbers that described real lives and figuring out where the system was, failing the people inside it. The coal allocation for the winter had been set in October. It was now December, 6 weeks into the cold, and the per-family distribution numbers were already running short in 3 districts. Not by accident, by the mathematics of a formula that had underestimated usage by a consistent margin for 3 consecutive years, and which no one had corrected because no one had gone back to compare the estimates against the actual figures from the previous years. Dorothea had gone back. She had the comparison table with her, compiled on her own time, in the evenings, in the same steady handwriting she'd used for the Calderwick estate folder that now sat in her desk at Bellgrave House and would never be delivered. She laid it on the table. "The formula used to set winter allocations," she said, "has been underestimating usage by approximately 14% for 3 years running. I've compared the October projections against the actual consumption figures for each year. The error compounds because we never corrected the baseline. If we adjust now and reallocate from the contingency fund," the room was quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of inattention, the quiet of people listening with unusual care. "That would cover the shortfall through February," she continued, "and still leave the contingency at approximately 60%, which is above the committee's minimum threshold." She sat back. She folded her hands. The committee voted to adopt the reallocation. It passed without significant opposition. Afterward, in the corridor, one of the junior members, a young man she barely knew, just down from Oxford, earnest and slightly overwhelmed, came to find her. "My lady," he said, "I only wanted to say the comparison table you brought. I've been on this committee for 6 months, and no one ever brought that." "How did you—" "I compared the estimates against the outcomes," Dorothea said simply. "It is not complicated. It requires only that one assumes the outcomes matter more than the convenience of not looking at them." She said it without drama. It was the truth, and it was also, she supposed, true about more than coal allocations. She was buttoning her gloves when the door at the end of the corridor opened and a man walked in she had not seen before. He was tall, perhaps 35, dark-haired, with the particular bearing of someone who had learned early that rooms would organize themselves around him and had long since stopped finding it remarkable. He wore good clothes without wearing them like a statement. He spoke to the committee secretary in a low, direct voice. She caught the faint cadence of a continental accent. Precisely controlled, the English flawless, but the rhythm slightly different, and then his eyes moved across the corridor. They settled on Dorothea for a moment, in the way eyes settle when something unexpected has registered. Then he looked away, and she fastened the last button of her gloves. And they went their separate ways into the gray December afternoon. She did not know yet who he was. She did not know that he had arrived in London 3 weeks ago on a diplomatic mission from the Grand Duchy of Falconried. She did not know that his name was Prince Matthias, that he had come to study how London's charity organizations managed financial oversight, or that he had been standing in the doorway long enough to hear her explain, to a junior committee member, that outcomes matter more than the convenience of not looking at them. She did not know any of that. She knew only that the Tuesday committee meeting had produced a reallocation that would heat 3 districts through February, that Mr. Pemberton had smiled at her with genuine warmth as she left, and that 11 days after a man had stood in her drawing room and told her he had chosen someone else. She had gotten up, pinned her hair, walked out into London, and done something that mattered. It was not nothing. It was in fact the beginning of everything. Rupert Castermere, on that same Tuesday, was at Newmarket with Lady Sabina Redmayne. They made a striking pair. Everyone agreed. Sabina's laugh carried across the pavilion like music. Rupert stood beside her with the particular ease of a man who has made a decision he believes in and has not yet encountered its consequences. He had not in 11 days thought much about the pale blue folder on Dorothea's desk, or the correspondence list, or the 17 items that had needed checking. He had thought, occasionally, about the moment she had removed the ring, the absence of tears, but he had decided quickly, firmly, in the way one decides things one does not wish to examine, that it was a sign of her character, that she had never been particularly warm, that she had always been more at home with a ledger than with a person. He watched Sabina applaud as her horse crossed the finish line 3 lengths ahead of the field, and he told himself that this brightness, this ease, this feeling of choosing rather than being chosen was what he had needed. He almost believed it. He would believe it, in fact, for several months longer. That was the particular mercy and cruelty of his position. The consequences were real, but they were not yet visible. And he was a man who had always been better at managing what he could see. The folder stayed on Dorothea's desk. The letter to the Calderwick Agricultural Committee was never sent. No one for quite some time adjusted the baseline. The January committee meetings ran on a different schedule than December's twice weekly now, because the coal shortfall Dorothea had identified had produced a secondary crisis that no one had anticipated. The adjusted reallocation had held through Christmas, but a hard freeze in the first week of the new year had pushed consumption past even the corrected estimates, and 3 of the Southwark districts were running short again. The committee had a contingency fund. The contingency fund had a threshold, and someone needed to decide before Thursday whether to breach it. That someone, as it turned out, was Dorothea. Not because she held any official authority. She held no title within the committee structure, no position that would have appeared on any formal record. What she held was the spreadsheet, the actual one, with the actual figures, cross-referenced against the actual consumption reports, and the patience to have constructed it when no one else had. Which meant that when the room needed to understand what the numbers were saying, they needed her. She had noticed this pattern long before Rupert left. The way competence, in a woman, became something that was used rather than something that was seen. The committee would have her figures. The committee would rely on her analysis. The committee would vote in accordance with what her analysis demonstrated. And then the minutes would record the vote, and the attribution would read, "Resolved by the committee, following discussion." She had accepted this for years, because it was the architecture of the world she lived in. And she was a practical woman. Invisible credit was still credit that helped people. The coal still reached the families. That was what mattered. She still believed that. She had simply stopped pretending that the invisibility was without cost. It was at the second Tuesday meeting in January that he walked in again. She recognized him from the corridor encounter in December. The height, the particular controlled quality of his bearing, the continental precision in the way he spoke to the secretary at the door. This time, however, he did not merely cross the corridor. He was shown into the meeting room itself, introduced by Mr. Pemberton, with the slightly flustered formality of a man who has just learned his committee has attracted royal attention. "Gentlemen and Lady Dorothea, may I present His Highness Prince Matthias of Falconreid. His Highness is in London on behalf of Duchy and has expressed interest in observing how the committee manages its oversight process." "With the committee's permission, of course," said the senior trustee, who was already sitting straighter. Prince Matthias took the chair at the end of the table, not at the head, which would have been presumptuous, but at the far end, which positioned him as an observer without pretending to be absent. He opened a small notebook. He said nothing. He listened with the quality of someone who genuinely intended to absorb rather than merely to be seen absorbing, which was, in Dorothea's experience, considerably rarer than it should have been. The meeting moved through its agenda. The contingency fund question came up 40 minutes in. The committee accountant, a thin, meticulous man named Hargreaves, who wore the same brown coat to every meeting and whom Dorothea had always liked for his scrupulous accuracy, presented the situation. Coal costs had increased 18% above the October projection. The committee was being asked to approve additional expenditure from the contingency reserve. Market prices have risen, Hargreaves said. It's been a hard winter. We'll need to authorize the additional draw. The senior trustee nodded. Two other members began reaching for their pens. Dorothea did not reach for her pen. She was looking at the two supplier invoices that Hargreaves had included in the documentation packet. She had received them that morning and had only glanced at them then. Now she read them carefully. The names were different. Ashford Coal Merchants, Linton Supply Company, both listed as separate vendors. Both invoiced to the committee in the same billing period. Both approved independently by different committee subgroups. Different letterheads, different account numbers, different contact names at the top of each letter. The warehouse number was identical, not similar, not in the same district. Identical. The same 6-digit reference number printed in the same position on both invoices, referring to the same physical location from which both supposedly distinct companies were operating. One contractor, two invoices, 18% of a cost increase that was not a market fluctuation at all. It was fraud. Wait, Dorothea said. Every head in the room turned. She was aware, distantly, that Prince Matthias had stopped writing in his notebook. These two invoices. She placed them side by side on the table, turning them so the room could see. Ashford Coal Merchants and Linton Supply. They've been approved as separate vendors, but the warehouse referenced this number here. On both documents it's the same. Hargreaves leaned forward. His expression went through several stages in quick succession. That can't... He stopped. He put on his glasses. He looked at both invoices. A silence fell that had a particular quality, the quality of a room understanding. All at once, that it has been wrong about something significant. We've been billed twice, Dorothea said. The price increase isn't market-driven. We've been paying the same contractor out of two separate accounts, under two separate names, for the same supply. The difference between what coal actually costs and what we've been paying is not 18% of market variance. It's one vendor collecting twice. The room erupted in the controlled, urgent way that rooms erupt when respectable men suddenly realize they have been made to look foolish. From the far end of the table, a voice cut through the noise. How did you see that? She looked up. Prince Matthias was watching her. His notebook was closed, his pen was set down. He was entirely focused on her, with an expression that was not admiration, not the performative. Decorative admiration she had received from men at dinner parties, when she said something mildly clever, but something more substantive. Something that looked, she thought, like genuine curiosity. I looked where everyone else had already decided there was nothing worth seeing. A beat of silence. Just the two of them briefly across a table full of other people. Then Hargreaves was calling for the vendor files, and two trustees were already arguing about who had approved the Linton account without cross-checking. And Mr. Pemberton was asking someone to fetch the committee's legal advisor. And the meeting dissolved into controlled crisis. Dorothea answered the questions directed at her, provided the documentation, walked Hargreaves through the comparison line by line. She did it with the same steady efficiency she brought to everything. She did not look at the end of the table again. She didn't need to. She could feel, with some quiet certainty she couldn't explain, that he was still watching. The meeting did not formally conclude so much as exhaust itself 2 hours later. The fraud referral had been drafted. The contractor had been suspended pending investigation. The committee's legal advisor had arrived, reviewed the invoices, and used the word prosecution twice in the same sentence. Dorothea gathered her papers, accepted Mr. Pemberton's rather emotional expression of gratitude, and moved toward the door. Prince Matthias was in the corridor. He was not waiting in any obvious sense. He was speaking to his aide, a young man in a dark coat, who was writing something in a ledger with the focused haste of someone keeping up with a rapid dictation. But when Dorothea came through the door, Matthias paused mid-sentence and turned. Lady Dorothea, It was only mildly surprising that he knew her name. The committee members had used it freely throughout the meeting. "Your Highness, I wanted to thank you," Matthias said. "The fund Falconreed is building would have been vulnerable to exactly this mechanism. Duplicate invoicing under subsidiary names, it's more common than it should be." A pause. "I would not have known to look for the warehouse reference. Most people don't look at the reference numbers at all," Dorothea said. "They look at the totals. The totals were plausible, so no one questioned them. And you look at the reference numbers. I look at everything." She said it without self-congratulation. It was simply true. It is a habit, not a virtue. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, a useful distinction. He inclined his head. "Good afternoon, Lady Dorothea." "Good afternoon, Your Highness." She walked out into the January cold, and it was only in the carriage home, watching the gray city move past the window, that she allowed herself to notice he had not mentioned Calderwick. He had not mentioned the cancelled wedding. He had not looked at her with the particular quality of careful consideration she had become accustomed to seeing in people who knew what had happened, that weighing look, that slight recalibration of expectation downward. He had looked at her as though what had happened in that meeting room was entirely the point. As though she were entirely the point. She found it unexpectedly disorienting. She was not sure what to do with it yet. She tucked it away, carefully, in the same interior space, where she had kept things that required more consideration than the present moment allowed. It was only after the carriage had gone 3 more streets that she thought to wonder what his aide might have told him. Once she was gone, she was right to wonder. Matthias walked back into the meeting room to retrieve his coat, and his aide, a conscientious young man named Werner, who was responsible for briefing the prince on every significant personage they encountered in London, fell into step beside him. "Your Highness, that was Lady Dorothea Bellgrave." "Yes, I gathered. Should that name mean something to me?" Matthias pulled on his coat. Werner cleared his throat in the specific way that preceded uncomfortable social intelligence. There was a rather prominent case last autumn. She was engaged to the Duke of Calderwick. He cancelled the wedding 36 hours before the ceremony. For another woman, Matthias paused. One button done, one not. He looked at Werner with the expression of someone filing information rather than reacting to it. "And this is considered significant. It was something of a scandal." "Your Highness, she's been there. Our invitations she no longer receives." "Certain circles, what it tells me," Matthias said, finishing his coat, "is something about the Duke." He picked up his notebook. "It tells me nothing about her." Werner blinked. "No. Your Highness, schedule time with her before the end of the week, if she's willing. I want to understand the committee's oversight methodology. She understands it better than anyone else in that room." "Of course." "Your Highness." Matthias walked out. Werner wrote it down. Neither of them saw Dorothea's carriage turning the corner at the end of the street, carrying her home with her new and slightly confusing awareness of how it felt to be seen entirely on her own terms. By February, the pattern of their working acquaintance had established itself with the quiet efficiency of 2 people who discover, without making any fuss about it, that they think in compatible registers. Matthias sent her documents before meetings, not summaries, the actual documents, with the actual figures, with his own notes in the margins. She had received over the years many documents from men who believed they were consulting her. Those documents typically arrived after the decision had already been shaped, when what was actually requested was her endorsement rather than her judgment. The margins had been clean. The conclusions had been foregone. Matthias's margins were full, not with conclusions, with questions. Is this the correct metric? The previous quarter's figures don't support this assumption. What am I missing? The labor cost here seems inconsistent with the transport schedule. Do you see the same problem? She answered the questions. He read the answers. She could tell he read them, because at the next meeting, the proposal had changed in the specific places where her answers had pointed. It was a small thing. It was also, she discovered, an almost entirely unfamiliar thing, and the unfamiliarity of it produced in her a feeling she misidentified as suspicion before she understood it was something closer to the cautious recognition of something rare. The third time it happened, the third time she sent notes on a proposal, and the proposal came back demonstrably altered. In response, she waited until after the committee meeting to raise it. Most of the room had cleared. Matthias was speaking to Hargreaves about the fraud investigation's progress. And when Hargreaves excused himself, Dorothea set her papers on the table and said, "You changed the labor allocation in the Northern District proposal." Matthias turned. "I did. The original formula favored consolidated housing over distributed family payments. You've reversed it. You were right. Consolidated housing reduces individual choice in a situation where choice is one of the few dignities people still have." She was quiet for a moment. Not performing quiet, actually quiet, because the sentence had landed somewhere that required a moment to absorb. "Is that so extraordinary?" Matthias asked. Dorothea looked at him steadily. "More than it should be." He held her gaze for a second longer than strictly necessary. Then he gathered his notebook and said, without making anything of it, "I'll send you the revised railway allocation report before Friday's meeting. The eastern section figures look irregular to me, but I'm not certain why. I'd like to know whether you see it. I'll look at it. Thank you." He left. She stayed at the table for a moment, aware of something she couldn't quite name, a kind of recalibration. As if a measurement she had been taking of herself for years had just produced an unexpected result. Then she picked up her papers and went home, and that evening she sat with the railway report when it arrived and found the irregularity he had missed within 20 minutes, and wrote him a response that was 3 pages long, and felt for the first time in months entirely like herself. Across London, in a very different world, the season was proceeding with considerable beauty. Rupert Castermere had by February acquired a reputation as one of the more romantically compelling figures in society, a duke who had sacrificed duty for love, a man who had chosen feeling over arrangement, as the gossip column had so helpfully framed it. He and Sabina attended everything. She made rooms brighter. He stood beside her with the ease of a man who has not yet encountered the edges of his decision. In March, there was Newmarket again. In April, a house party in Wiltshire that everyone agreed was the best of the year. The opera, the late suppers, the private dinners with people who had no interest in discussing tenant income or drainage proposals or banking terms. Rupert did not think about the pale blue folder. He did not think about the letter to the Calderwick Agricultural Committee that had never been sent. He did not, specifically and with effort, think about the absence of tears in his former fiancée's eyes when she placed the ring on the desk. He thought about Sabina. He thought about the races. He thought pleasantly that a man who has spent his 30s doing what duty requires has earned the right to spend a season doing what he desires. This seemed entirely reasonable to him. He was a man who was good at making things seem reasonable, including to himself. What he was not thinking about, because the bills had not yet arrived in their full force, was the condition of the Calderwick East roof, which had been deteriorating for 2 seasons and had reached the point where the housekeeper had written 3 letters to the estate manager, and the estate manager had forwarded them to His Grace's London, addressed twice. Rupert had received the letters. He had intended to address them. The intention had been interrupted by a house party in Wiltshire. He was not thinking about the railway investment he had made in November, a syndicate that had been recommended by men he trusted at his club. Men who had made convincing arguments about guaranteed returns and minimal exposure. Dorothea had looked at the prospectus when he'd mentioned it, during one of their last conversations before everything ended, and had said something about guarantees that depend on one company paying another company owned by the same men. He had laughed. Not unkindly, he had genuinely found it a little charming. Her habit of finding danger in every column. He was not thinking about any of this, because it was spring and Sabina was laughing, and the season was very bright. That brightness, as it happened, had approximately 4 months left. But for now it was real, and he believed in it, and the believing felt like freedom. He would need to believe that for a while longer, for the purposes of understanding, later, exactly what freedom had cost him. Back in the world of the committee's Tuesday meetings, spring arrived with a different quality. The fraud case had moved through its early stages. The contractor had been identified, and the legal proceedings were sufficiently advanced that the committee could return its attention to actual relief work rather than investigation. This produced, in the April meetings, a shift in focus toward the coming summer and its particular pressures dockworkers between seasons. Families stretched thin by the gap between winter coal allocations and summer employment. Matthias was still attending the meetings. He was not supposed to be still attending the meetings, in the sense that his initial purpose, studying oversight methodology, had been satisfied within the first 3 sessions. He continued to attend, and when his aide raised this during a carriage ride in March, he said simply that the committee's work was still relevant to Falconreid's fund construction. And Werner wrote this down and did not inquire further. Because Werner was good at his job. What was actually true was more direct than that. But Matthias was a man who moved carefully with true things. He had learned in the particular school of minor royal diplomacy that true things announced too quickly become awkward obligations. And he had no interest in obligations that had not been freely chosen on both sides. He was aware that he looked forward to Tuesday. He was aware of the specific quality of attention he paid when Dorothea entered the room. The way he noted when she arrived tired versus when she arrived with the focused energy of someone who had been thinking about a problem since breakfast. He was aware that he had begun structuring his notes around questions that would produce a reason to send her documents, and that this was not, strictly speaking, about the committee. He was also aware that she was managing something. Not grief exactly, or not grief only, something more like the careful reconstruction of a person who had been told, by an event she had not chosen, that she might need to be rebuilt from different materials than she'd originally selected. He recognized it because he had done something similar himself, at 25 for different reasons, and he knew that the wrong kind of attention at the wrong moment could interrupt the process in ways that were difficult to repair. So he sent her documents. He asked her questions. He changed the proposals when she was right, which was frequently. He held the chair at the end of the table nearest the door, the one with the slightly better sight line to the window, without ever explicitly designating it in a way that meant it was simply there when she arrived. He ordered the committee tea service to include less sugar after noticing, in February, that she had quietly moved her cup to the side 3 Tuesdays in a row. He did not pretend to himself that these were ordinary things. He also did not press them into any shape they were not yet ready to take. The work was real. The respect was real. He trusted that if everything else was also real, it would find its form in its own time. One afternoon in May, a bright afternoon, the kind that makes London briefly feel forgiving, he arrived at the committee building to find Dorothea already there, standing in the main corridor with a document in her hand and an expression that told him she had found something. "The Summer Labor Transition Fund," she said without preamble. The allocation model assumed that seasonal dock workers transition out of employment in a single wave, mid-June, but the shipping records show 3 distinct waves: early June, late June, and mid-July, depending on cargo type and vessel class. If we front-load the payments for the early wave and stagger the remaining disbursements, we can cover more families without increasing the total fund. Matthias stopped walking. He looked at the document she was holding. He looked at her. "When did you work this out? Last night?" A slight pause. "And this morning?" "The shipping records took some time." "You went through the shipping records. They're public filings." "Anyone can." "Lady Dorothea," he said it quietly, not interrupting so much as landing on the moment. "No one else on this committee went through the shipping records." She looked at him. There was a quality in her eyes that he had learned to recognize over 4 months of Tuesday meetings, a brief, unguarded moment before the composure reasserted itself. When something genuine surfaced, it was the obvious next step, she said. It was the step that required someone to think past the obvious and then do 3 hours of work on a Monday evening. He took the document from her. Gently. "Shall we bring this to the committee?" "That's why I'm here." "Good." He turned toward the meeting room. And then, without looking back, "You should know that when I take this to the room, I intend to be clear that the methodology is yours." She was quiet behind him for just a moment. He didn't turn. "You don't need to do that," she said. "I am aware I don't need to. I intend to do it regardless." He pushed open the meeting room door. I find credit is most useful when it reaches the person who earned it. She walked past him into the room. She set her papers on the table. She did not look at him again right away. But when the meeting began, and Matthias presented the shipping record analysis and said, without qualification, that the methodology had been developed by Lady Dorothea Bellgrave, and had he not had the benefit of her work, the committee would have been looking at a structurally flawed disbursement model for the next 6 months. She looked up briefly from her own notes. Their eyes met across the table. She gave him nothing extravagant, no warmth on display for a roomful of trustees. Just a slight nod, the acknowledgement of someone who has been seen accurately, perhaps for the first time in a long time, and is still deciding what to do with the feeling. Matthias nodded back. Then he returned to the presentation. And the committee voted, and the fund model was approved. And someone made a note in the minutes that would actually carry her name. She noticed that too. He had made sure of it. The Tuesday after the fund model vote, a small thing happened that Dorothea found herself returning to in the days afterward, unable to entirely account for why it persisted. The meeting had run long, a dispute about contractor verification processes that had consumed 40 minutes more than anyone intended, and by the time it concluded, the tea service had gone cold, and most members were moving toward the door with the hurried quality of people with other obligations. Dorothea was gathering her papers at the far end of the table when she heard Matthias's voice from the doorway. "Lady Dorothea, you're walking to your carriage?" "I am. I'll walk with you, if that's not inconvenient." It was a distance of perhaps 30 yards, from the building entrance to where the Bellgrave carriage waited on the street. Not objectively a significant walk. They made it in perhaps 2 minutes. In those 2 minutes, he asked what she thought about a question in the Falconreed Fund documentation that had been raised in passing during the meeting, whether the Oversight Committee for the fund should have an independent auditor or whether internal review was sufficient. She told him she thought internal review was a structural conflict, regardless of how conscientious the reviewers were, that the committee would always be evaluating its own decisions, and that independence didn't mean distrust, it meant accountability. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I've been arguing for independent audit and getting pushback from 3 of the trustees. That's the clearest case I've heard for it. Then use it. With your permission, I'd like to reference the reasoning in the written proposal." She was at the carriage door by then. She turned back to look at him. The May afternoon was doing something generous with the light, and he was standing with his hat in his hand. He had removed it when he came through the building door. A habitual courtesy, and had not replaced it, and looking at her with the attentive focus she had come to recognize as his default mode of being present. She thought about Rupert, the number of times she had made an argument in 5 years, and been thanked for the interesting thought, and then watched the decision go in another direction, without the reasoning she'd offered being engaged at all. Not dismissed with hostility, simply not absorbed. The courtesy of a man who had already made up his mind, and was listening only long enough to be polite about it. "Yes," she said, "use it, thank you." She stepped up into the carriage. The footman closed the door. Through the window she could see Matthias replace his hat, speak a word to Werner, and turn back toward the building. She had told him something true, and he had heard it. And he intended to use it, and he had asked permission, rather than simply taking it. She sat with that for the length of the carriage ride home. It was not romantic feeling, or it was not only that. Or she was not willing yet to name what it was, because naming it felt premature in ways she couldn't fully articulate. What it was, more precisely, was the recognition of something she had not known was missing until she encountered it in its presence. She was used to being useful. She was used to being competent, and occasionally appreciated, and quietly relied upon, and never quite credited. She was not used to being consulted. She was not used to a man who sent documents with questions in the margins, who changed the proposal when she was right, who walked her to her carriage and asked what she thought, and then intended to use the reasoning in a formal document with her name on it. She was not used to mattering in exactly the way she actually mattered. She opened her notebook during the carriage ride. She turned to a clean page. She wrote, in her precise handwriting, a list of 3 things she would need to review before the Friday meeting. And under the list she wrote nothing else, because she was a practical woman, and there was work to be done, and the feeling she was declining to name was not yet ready to be put into words. But it was there, and she did not try to make it leave. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, and Matthias read it twice before he set it down. It had come from Hartwell and Sons, the London banking syndicate that had been managing the preliminary bond arrangement for Falconreid's infrastructure loan. The language was formal and carefully constructed in the way that letters are carefully constructed when the writer wants to deliver bad news without appearing to deliver bad news. What it said, stripped of its courtesies, was this. The syndicate had conducted a review of Falconreid's financial position and had concluded that the Grand Duchy's credit exposure was materially higher than previously disclosed. Given this finding, the syndicate was suspending its commitment to the loan arrangement pending further investigation, and it recommended that Matthias address the concerns with his home government before proceeding. The letter listed 3 documents as the basis for this conclusion. A bond repayment schedule showing Falconreid already committed beyond its annual revenue. A freight billing record indicating the duchy had pre-purchased railway materials far in excess of the specifications. And an insurance declaration showing cargo covered twice, once by the duchy's fund, once by a separate private insurer, suggesting either fraud or catastrophic mismanagement. Matthias did not recognize any of these documents. He had been managing this loan arrangement since November. He had reviewed every financial filing that passed through the diplomatic mission. The documents the syndicate was citing as evidence of Falconreid's financial recklessness were not documents he had ever seen before. Which meant one of 2 things. Either someone within the duchy's administration had been conducting expenditures without his knowledge, or someone outside it had manufactured evidence of expenditures that had never occurred. He called Werner before the letter had been on the desk 5 minutes. Get me the Falconreid bond files, everything from November to current date, and find out who at the syndicate authorized this letter. Werner was already writing. And Lady Dorothea, Your Highness. Matthias looked at the letter again. The freight billing record, the insurance declarations, the layered financial paperwork that was designed to tell a story. He knew to exactly one person who would see through it faster than he would. Request a meeting for this afternoon, he said. Tell her it's urgent. Dorothea arrived at the diplomatic mission on Grosvenor Square at 2 o'clock. She had brought nothing with her except the bag she always carried to committee meetings, compact, dark leather, containing her notebook, her pen case, and the habit of attention she had carried, since before she could name it as anything other than the way she was built. Werner met her at the door and brought her through to the working room, where Matthias kept his formal correspondence, a room she had not been in before, lined with document boxes and a large central table that was already occupied by a significant quantity of paper. Matthias stood at the near end of the table, his coat off, his sleeves still properly buttoned at the wrist, reading something with the particular focused frown of a man who has been reading it repeatedly and likes it less each time. He looked up when she entered. Thank you for coming quickly. Your aide said urgent. She set her bag on the chair nearest the table. What has happened? He handed her the letter. She read it. She read it again. He watched her face, because he had learned over the past months that her face during reading was a more precise instrument than most people's faces during speech, small shifts, slight compressions, the brief hardening around the eyes when something didn't add up. She looked up from the letter, and her expression told him she had already found something. May I see the documents they cited? He laid them on the table. She did not pick them up immediately. She looked at them first, the way she always looked at things, taking the shape of the information before engaging with its content, reading the architecture of the argument before the argument itself. Then she picked up the freight billing record. She was quiet for 90 seconds. He timed it without meaning to. This bill, she said. The shipping date on the primary cargo manifest, June the 14th. The freight route listed is Hamburg to Grimsby, with an intermediate stop at Bremerhaven. She set it down and picked up the insurance declaration. This declaration covers the same cargo. It's dated June the 12th. She looked up. 2 days before the cargo was shipped, someone declared insurance on it at a port of origin it hadn't left yet. Matthias went very still. An insurance company requires proof of shipment before issuing a marine declaration, Dorothea continued, her voice steady and precise. The dates are impossible. Either the cargo was shipped before the bill says it was, which would mean the bill is falsified, or the insurance was declared before the cargo moved, which would mean the declaration is falsified. She placed both documents side by side. Either way, someone manufactured one of these, and manufactured it sloppily enough that the dates don't survive a basic calendar check. Can you prove it? The question came out quiet and direct. He meant it exactly as it sounded, not as a challenge, but as an operational question. The first step in a sequence of steps. She looked at him. Not yet? Then tell me what you need. She was quiet for a beat, just one beat, and he had the impression that the answer to that question had landed somewhere particular for her. Then she was already turning back to the documents. I need the customs manifests for the Hamburg-Grimsby route for June. If the cargo moved on the 14th, there will be a port record. If it didn't, there won't be, and the billing record is false. I need someone with diplomatic access to request those records. I can't do it myself. She picked up the second document, the bond repayment schedule, and I need to know who issued this schedule. The format is correct. The Falconreid seal is correct. But the account numbering at the bottom uses a suffix I've seen before in the committee fraud case. It's a convention used by one specific group of London accounting firms. This didn't originate in your duchy. Matthias pulled up a chair to the opposite side of the table. He sat down. He looked at her across the spread of documents and understood, with a clarity that had been building for months, that what he was looking at was not merely competence. It was the kind of analytical intelligence that most institutions never found a legitimate use for because the person it lived in was a woman and the institutions hadn't learned to accommodate that yet. He was going to fix that, right now in this room, and publicly when the time came. Werner. He raised his voice without taking his eyes off the documents. Werner appeared in the doorway. I need you to contact the Hamburg Port Authority through the diplomatic channel. Request the cargo manifests for all Bremerhaven-Grimsby freight, registered between the 1st and 20th of June. Full records, not summaries. He picked up the bond repayment schedule and crossed to Werner. And take this to our solicitor. I want a company registration search on every accounting firm in London that uses this suffix format. Every one. He handed it over. Today Werner's was already moving. Dorothea was already working. They spent 4 hours at that table. The afternoon light moving across the document boxes as the June day stretched long and late. And what they assembled in those 4 hours was not yet proof, but was something considerably better than a suspicion. It was a pattern. The freight bills showed 3 impossible dates cargo declared, shipped before the vessels that carried it had cleared their prior ports of call. The insurance declarations duplicated coverage that had already been registered under a different company name. The bond repayment schedule used account numbering that traced. Through the company registration search, Werner's solicitor, produced by 6 o'clock, to a network of 3 interconnected firms, Kelmore Financial Services, Ashton Briggs Securities, and a holding company called Meridian Trade Partners. 2 names, Dorothea noted without expression, that had appeared in another context she recognized with cold precision. Kelmore, she said, and Meridian. She set down the registration document. The coal contractor fraud from January. The warehouse reference number fraud. The supplier was operating through a subsidiary of Meridian Trade Partners. Matthias looked up from the customs manifest he was reading. The same group, the same mechanism. Duplicate invoicing. Falsified documentation, subsidiary names obscuring a single controller. She stood, moved to the window, not to look out of it but to think. The way she always moved when she was assembling something large. They have a methodology. They used it against the charity committee in January, and it worked until I found it. Now they're using it against a foreign government's credit position. And the stakes are considerably higher. She turned back. Someone identified Falconreid as a target. Someone with access to your bond documents, and enough financial sophistication to manufacture a credible paper trail. Someone who knew what documents would frighten a London banking syndicate. Yes. She returned to the table. And someone with enough connections at Hartwell to ensure the letter was taken seriously before anyone looked closely at the dates. Matthias set down the customs manifest. Who benefits if the Falconreed loan collapses? A competing infrastructure project gets the cleared capital, or a competing contractor gets the railway work. She pulled out her notebook. Or both. The same men can be running both operations. She looked up. I need to see the list of contractors who bid on the Falconreed railway reconstruction and were not selected. He produced it from the bond file within 30 seconds. She ran her finger down the list, stopped. Meridian Trade Partners submitted a bid, she said. The room went quiet in the way it had gone quiet in January, when Hargreaves had put on his glasses and looked at 2 invoices and understood what he was seeing. Only this time there was no room full of trustees. There was only Matthias and Dorothea, and a table covered in documents, and the specific silence of 2 people who have just confirmed the shape of something serious. They lost the contract, Matthias said, and instead of accepting the outcome, they manufactured evidence to destroy Falconreed's credit, collapse the loan and reopen the bidding. With Falconreed discredited, the Grand Duke would be forced to renegotiate at less favorable terms. The new terms would likely require a different contractor. She closed her notebook. One already positioned to step in. Matthias did. He walked to the end of the table, picked up the original letter from Hartwell, looked at it for one long moment and set it back down. Can we prove all of it? The dates we can prove the port records alone establish that the cargo manifest is falsified. The account numbering traces to Meridian through the company registration. The duplicate insurance, we need the original registration documents from both insurers. But those are obtainable. She looked at him. We can prove enough to require an investigation. Whether the investigation produces enough for prosecution depends on how carefully they covered the internal communications. Then we proceed with what we can prove. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. I'll contact Hartwell's director directly tonight and request a formal review meeting. I want the bank's internal documentation of who brought these allegations to them. If they got the false documents through a contact at the bank may not cooperate willingly. I'm not asking them to cooperate willingly. I'm asking them to sit across a table from their own legal exposure if they had any part in this, and see whether willing becomes more available. He looked at her. I need you at that meeting. Dorothea was quiet for precisely 1 second. I'm a woman on a relief committee. I don't have standing at a formal banking review. You will attend as a consultant to the Grand Duchy of Falconreed's diplomatic mission in an advisory capacity. He said it with the calm efficiency of someone removing an obstacle by reclassifying it. Werner will have the documentation prepared tonight. Your analytical work is on record with the committee. No one at Hartwell will question the credential. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression that she was managing carefully, not distrust. Not quite, but the particular wariness of a woman who has been given roles before that turned out to be ceremonial. If I am in that room, she said, I am working. Not present, I know exactly what you are. Matthias said it without hesitation. Without qualification. That is why I asked. The meeting at Hartwell & Sons took place on the following Monday morning, and it was not a comfortable meeting for several of the men in the room. Matthias had requested it through the Grand Duke's formal diplomatic channel, which meant Hartwell's directors had spent the weekend in the slightly anxious position of having to prepare for a meeting they hadn't controlled the terms of. They arrived in their best coats with their most senior legal counsel and the particular brittle confidence of men who have convinced themselves that confidence is the same as being right. Dorothea sat to Matthias's left with a document portfolio that contained, in organized sequence, every piece of evidence they had assembled over the previous 72 hours. The Hartwell director, a florid, carefully presented man named Alderton, opened by expressing the syndicate's sincere concern for Falconreed's financial stability and its commitment to thorough due diligence. Matthias let him finish. Then he said, I'd like to begin with the freight billing record you cited in your letter of last Thursday. Alderton gestured to his counsel, who produced a copy. Dorothea placed her copy on the table. The cargo on this manifest invoice reference AG 1147. Hamburg to Grimsby, June 14th, is declared departed Hamburg on the 14th. The Hamburg Port Authority's manifest, which was obtained through diplomatic request last Friday, Shows the vessel listed as carrier did not clear Hamburg until June 17th. She placed the port record beside the invoice. The bill is dated 3 days before the vessel left port. The cargo it describes did not exist on June 14th. Alderton looked at the two documents. He looked at his counsel. A particular quality of silence entered the room. Additionally, Dorothea continued, because she was working, and there was more. The insurance declaration cited in the same letter issued by Meridian Trade Partners Insurance Subsidiary is dated June 12th, 2 days before a departure that itself didn't occur until the 17th. Marine insurance cannot be legitimately declared before cargo has been confirmed for shipping. She placed the insurance documents. Both documents are falsified. They were not generated by Falconreid's administration. They were generated by Meridian Trade Partners, which submitted an unsuccessful bid for the Falconreid Railway contract in September, and whose account numbering convention, this suffix format here, appears on the bond repayment schedule, you also cited as evidence of financial mismanagement. The room was silent in a thorough and absolute way. Matthias watched Alderton and saw them when the director understood that the question was no longer whether Falconreid's credit was sound. The question was how Alderton's syndicate had come to be in possession of fraudulent documents, and what they had done with them, and whether anyone at Hartwell had known what they were receiving. We would like, Matthias said, very quietly, to understand how these documents reached your desk. Mr. Alderton, it took 3 more hours, 2 consultations with Hartwell's legal counsel, and 1 very uncomfortable conversation about the bank's internal communication records. But by noon the shape of it was clear. A mid-level official at the indicate a man with no formal connection to Meridian, but with a significant personal debt to one of its principals, had received the falsified documents through a private channel and passed them upward as a credible third-party report. He had not manufactured the documents. He had simply asked no questions about where they came from. Because the debt made in curiosity convenient, the syndicate, faced with the choice between continued exposure and immediate cooperation, chose cooperation. By 3 o'clock, the loan suspension had been lifted pending the formal investigation of Meridian Trade Partners, which Hartwell's own legal team was now considerably motivated to support. The customs records, the duplicate insurance registrations, the company registration linkages between Kelmore, Ashton Brigg, and Meridian, everything Dorothea had assembled, went into the bank's formal investigation file. When the meeting concluded, and the Hartwell contingent had filed out with the subdued energy of men who have been significantly outmaneuvered, Matthias returned to the committee table where Dorothea was organizing the remaining documents back into the portfolio. "It's enough to hold," she said without looking up. "The investigation will take months, but the loan is secure. They can't maintain the credit concern if their own legal team is prosecuting the source." "Yes." Matthias sat. He watched her hands moving across the documents, quick, precise, organized. "You should know that I intend to present a formal account of this matter to the Grand Duke, with a full description of the analysis that identified the pattern." She looked up. "Your name," he said, "will be in that account." She held his gaze for a moment. "That isn't necessary." "It is," he said, "because it is true. And because the next time someone dismisses your judgment, I want it on record somewhere that you saved a foreign government from a sophisticated financial fraud at a meeting table on a Monday morning. The record should be accurate." Something crossed her face that she did not entirely succeed in composing away before he saw it. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something older and more complicated than gratitude, the expression of someone who has been doing excellent work in the dark for a very long time, and has just been handed a lamp, and is not entirely sure yet that it's real. "I did what was obvious," she said. "Then the obvious is extraordinary." He stood. "Come, I'll have Werner arrange a carriage. You've been working for 7 hours." It was on the steps of Hartwell's building, while Werner was arranging the carriages, that Rupert Castermere appeared. Dorothea registered him before he registered her. She had the advantage of having looked up first, and for the 2 seconds before he turned and saw her, she had the strange experience of looking at a man who had once constituted the center of her future and finding him simply present. Not insignificant, not without effect, but not the same as he had been, which was perhaps the truest measure of how much the past 8 months had changed the internal geography of her life. Then he turned, and his face went through several things in rapid succession. And he walked toward her. Dorothea. He stopped at a polite distance. He was well dressed as always, but there was something around his eyes that had not been there the last time she had seen him. Attention. A tightening, the look of a man managing something he had not yet named as serious. Rupert, a pause. He glanced at the building behind her. At the falconried diplomatic crest on the document portfolio Werner was carrying to the carriage. "I heard you were working with the prince," Rupert said. "I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't expect to be here a week ago either." She kept her voice even. "Is there something you need?" He was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a man choosing words carefully, which was not a mode she had seen from him often. Rupert had usually moved through the world with the ease of someone who had not needed to choose carefully. "I need to speak with you about the Hartwell Syndicate," he said. "Calderwick has an investment position in their primary fund. The accounts are showing irregularities that I don't understand. And I was told you might." He stopped. He looked at her with an expression that was part pride, part something considerably less comfortable than pride. "I was told you had been working on something related to the syndicate's documentation. I thought you might be willing to look at the Calderwick position." The wind moved between them. Behind her, Werner had the carriage door open and was waiting without impatience. She had known this was coming. Not the specific shape of it, not that it would be on these steps. Not that it would be the Hartwell Syndicate, but she had known. In the way she had known about the railway investment, when he'd mentioned it 2 years ago. That the accounting would eventually arrive. She had warned him. He had laughed. She had filed the warning in the same interior space where she filed things she could not yet do anything about. And she had continued working, and the world had turned. And here was the accounting. "I warned you," she said. "Before the wedding. Before everything. I told you the guarantees in that syndicate depended on one company paying another company owned by the same men. I told you the structure was circular, I know." He met her eyes. "You were right. I warned you when my opinion cost you nothing," she said. "You dismissed it. You cannot purchase it now because the cost has risen." It wasn't cruel. She was not performing coldness, was not punishing him with a rehearsed line. It was the most accurate statement of the situation she could produce. And it was true in both directions, true about the money, and true about the 5 years, and true about the pale blue folder that had sat on her desk and never been delivered, and true about everything that the word arrangement had failed to contain. Rupert held her gaze for a moment. He nodded. Once. Slowly, "I understand. There are solicitors who handle this kind of position," she said. "I'll have my father's man send you a name." She picked up her bag. "I wish Calderwick's tenants well, Rupert. I always did." She walked to the carriage. Matthias was already inside. She stepped up. Werner closed the door. And the carriage moved away from the curb. Neither of them spoke for a full minute. Then Matthias said quietly, "Was refusing him difficult?" She looked at her hands, folded in her lap. She thought about lying not deceitfully, but in the way one is sometimes tempted to present a cleaner version of the truth. The version where the feeling is already resolved, rather than still in process. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He did not say anything further for a moment. He did not say that Rupert was foolish, did not say she was better off, did not reach for any of the several available consolations that would have been offered with good intentions, and landed badly. He didn't see it, Matthias said eventually. What he had. Not in any way that would have allowed him to hold it. She looked out the window. "No, that is his failure," Matthias said, "not yours." She turned to look at him. He was watching the street, giving her the particular consideration of not making the moment into something she had to respond to. Just stating it plainly and letting it rest. They worked late that evening, back at the diplomatic mission, assembling the final documentation package for the formal Grand Duke's report. The investigation referral had to be comprehensive. Every falsified document, every registration trace, every date discrepancy, and comprehensive meant hours. By 10 o'clock, Werner had gone home. The room was lit by 2 good lamps and occupied by a significant quantity of paper, and 2 people who had learned to work in the same space without narrating the process. Matthias looked up from the customs section of the report. He made you believe, he said without preamble, that being needed was the same as being valued. She did not ask who he meant. She set down her pen for a long time, she said. What would being valued look like to you now? He asked it with the same directness he brought to everything not intrusive. Not performance of sensitivity, just the genuine question of a man who wanted to know the answer. She thought about it. She did not reach for the first available words. Because the question deserved better than that. Being asked before the decision, she said finally. Being told the truth before the consequence. Being trusted before I have to prove I was right. The lamp between them was steady. The street outside was quiet. Then if I ever offer you anything more than work, Matthias said. Remind me of those 3 things. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise in any form she would have been obliged to answer. It was a seed, planted with the precision of a man who understood the difference between moving quickly and moving well, who had learned perhaps from watching what happened when other men moved quickly, that the things worth having were worth waiting for. She looked at him. He met her eyes and then returned to his documents, giving her the room to process it without audience. She picked up her pen, she returned to the report. She worked for another hour in silence that was not empty. And when she finally left that evening, she walked to the carriage with the awareness that something had shifted in the architecture of her interior life quietly. Without announcement, the way the most significant things tend to move. 3 days later, Matthias presented the formal documentation before an emergency session of the committee and a representative of the Grand Duke's London Council. He laid out the freight manifest discrepancies, the insurance declaration dates, the meridian registration traces, the bank official's admission, the full sequence of a fraud constructed specifically to destroy a sovereign state's financial credibility in London. And then he said, clearly and on record, in front of every person in that room, Lady Dorothea Bellgrave identified the pattern. She found the impossible dates, traced the account numbering, and assembled the analytical framework that made this investigation possible. I had the diplomatic authority to act. She had the judgment that made action meaningful. He paused. The record should reflect that accurately. It did. For the first time in a very long time, it did. The formal record of the Falconreid investigation, when it was entered into the committee's official minutes, occupied 4 pages. Dorothea's name appeared on the first page, in the attribution line, in the same size type as every other name in the document. It was a small thing. It was also the first time in 9 years of committee work that her name had appeared anywhere in a formal record, doing anything other than confirming attendance. She did not make anything of it aloud. She read the minutes when they arrived, found the page, read her name, and set the document down. Then she picked up the next item on her desk, which was a summary of the Summer Labor Fund's first disbursement cycle, and read that too. But she kept the minutes. She filed them in the same leather case where she kept the documents that mattered. And she did not examine too closely why they mattered. Because she was still a practical woman and there was still work to be done. And the particular quiet, deep satisfaction of having been seen accurately in a formal record was one she intended to hold carefully, rather than expose to too much air too quickly. Matthias sent her a note that same afternoon. It arrived with the day's correspondence, unremarkably in a plain envelope with the Falconreid diplomatic seal. It said, "The Grand Duke has received the report." His response was to ask who identified the insurance declaration discrepancy. I told him. He would like to know if you would be willing to advise the Falconreid Relief Fund on its oversight structure going forward. There is no obligation in either direction, M. She wrote back. I would be willing DB 3 sentences. Between the 2 of them. That was sufficient. What was happening at Calderwick that same month was considerably less quiet. The Hartwell Syndicate's suspension of activities, while lifted for the Falconreid loan, had triggered a review of all funds under management standard procedure when a fraud investigation touched any part of a banking operation. That review had produced, among other findings, a detailed account of every investment position held through the syndicate's primary fund. And among those positions, clearly listed, was the Calderwick Estate's investment of £40,000. placed in November on the recommendation of 3 men Rupert had trusted at his club, in a vehicle that the syndicate's own reviewers were now describing, in language of impressive precision, as structurally compromised. The loss was not total. That was the word Rupert's solicitor used, several times with the emphasis of a man finding the word useful. Not total. The position had lost approximately 60% of its value, and the investigation meant no recovery of principal for at minimum 18 months, while the legal proceedings ran their course. But it was not total. 60% of £40,000 was £24,000. In the current state of Calderwick's finances, £24,000 was the east wing roof, the 3 tenant cottages that needed rebuilding, the drainage project on the north fields that had been deferred for 2 years, and a significant portion of the operating reserve that kept the estate functional between harvest seasons. In practical terms, 60% of £40,000 was the difference between managing and not managing. Rupert sat with his solicitor on a Tuesday morning in July and understood, for perhaps the first time, with genuine clarity, what the word consequence actually meant when applied to a decision he had made himself, in full possession of his faculties, after someone who loved him had told him clearly what she saw. The solicitor was still talking something about recovery timelines and reduced expenditure plans, and Rupert was listening with the surface layer of his attention, while somewhere beneath it he was doing something he had been successfully avoiding for 8 months, which was thinking about Dorothea, not with desire, not with regret of the romantic variety, the easy kind where a man tells himself he simply chose wrong and the solution is to choose differently. He was thinking about her with something closer to comprehension, with the specific, belated, unwelcome understanding of what he had actually thrown away when he had thrown it away. He had gone through her old memoranda 2 nights ago. He wasn't sure what had prompted it, some combination of the solicitor's recovery timeline and a long evening alone at Calderwick with the ledgers that had always been Dorothea's domain far more than his. The memoranda had been filed in a wooden box in the estate office. The ones she had sent during the engagement period. The ones he had read and filed and told himself he would return to later. The one from March of last year, 14 months before the wedding that didn't happen. A detailed analysis of 3 banking alternatives, with comparison tables for interest rates, covenant terms, and what she called risk of covenant breach under agricultural stress. She had identified Hartwell's primary fund as the highest risk option. She had written in her clear, precise handwriting, "The guarantees in this vehicle are circular. One subsidiary company's solvency depends upon payments from another subsidiary owned by the same principals. In an agricultural downturn, the stress would propagate inward rather than being distributed across independent counterparties." He had written back, "Thank you, Dorothea. I'll discuss it with the estate manager." He had not discussed it with the estate manager. He had placed £40,000 with Hartwell in November because 3 men at his club had recommended it, and because the alternative options, the ones Dorothea had outlined with their lower returns, and their more transparent structures had seemed, at the time, insufficiently exciting. He had filed the memoranda and not gone back to them, and told himself, in the comfortable way of men who are very good at comfort, that she was excellent at details. He had not told himself, "She has judgment equal to mine." That distinction, sitting in the estate office at midnight with the memoranda spread around him, had arrived with the particular force of things understood too late to be useful. Sabina Redmayne had arrived at Calderwick at the end of May for what was intended to be a fortnight's visit. She was still gracious. She was still beautiful in the way that made rooms pay attention. She had brought the right clothes for the country and the right manner for the tenants, and she had tried, with genuine goodwill, to find Calderwick charming. She had found the gardens genuinely beautiful. She had been kind to the housekeeper and patient with the local families who came to call. What she could not find charming was the accounting. Not because she was shallow, she was not shallow, which was part of what made the problem so intractable. A shallow woman could have been managed with flattery and distraction. Sabina was clear-eyed enough to understand, by the 3rd week at Calderwick, that what was being asked of her was not a charming country retreat, but an indefinite redirection of her entire life toward the financial repair of an estate she had not married, in a partnership with a man who was increasingly occupied by mortgages rather than by her. She raised it on a Tuesday evening in June, after a dinner that had been interrupted twice by the estate manager's urgent notes. "This is not the life you promised me." She was not accusing. She was stating a fact, in the way she had always been honest. Because honesty had always been one of her genuine qualities. Rupert looked at her across the table. He was tired in a way that had been accumulating since November, and which the season's brightness had successfully obscured until the season ended. "It is my life," he said. They sat with that for a long moment. Two intelligent people, both capable of recognizing what was happening, even if recognizing it was painful. "I wanted you," Sabina said. I think I would want you if you were a different version of yourself. The version I fell in love with. That version had £40,000 more than I currently have," Rupert said. With a dry accuracy that surprised them both, Sabina almost smiled. "It wasn't the money." "No," he agreed. "It was what the money allowed." Which is the same argument with different vocabulary. She left Calderwick the following week. Not with drama, not with accusations, not with the door-slamming finale that London gossip would have preferred. She packed with the same practicality she had brought to everything, said goodbye to the housekeeper, and told Rupert that she hoped he would manage to be happy, and that she intended to try the same. He believed she meant it. He believed, watching her carriage disappear down the Calderwick Drive, that she was in most essential respects a good person who had made the same mistake he had. She had loved the best version of someone, rather than the whole of them. And the whole of them had eventually required a response she was not prepared to offer. He could not be angry with her for that. He had done the same thing in a different direction, 5 years earlier with considerably less excuse. He stood in the drive for a while after the carriage was gone. A warm July evening, the estate spreading around him in the long light, the east wing roof needing repair, the north fields needing drainage, the tenants needing a duke who was paying attention. All of it waiting, with the patient indifference of large necessary things, for someone to pick it up and carry it. He went back inside, sat down at the estate desk, and opened the ledgers. The charitable reception at the Whitmore Gallery in September was not an event Dorothea had looked forward to. It was the kind of gathering 30 or 40 people. Champagne, the usual geometry of London social life with its careful alliances and its invisible hierarchies that she attended, because not attending sent a message she declined to send. She was not hiding. She was not retreated. She was simply present. In the same rooms where London had decided to form its opinions about her. And she had been doing this long enough that it no longer required courage. Exactly, it required only the same steady continuation that had characterized her approach to everything since January. She was speaking with Mrs. Pemberton about the summer fund's disbursement figures when she became aware that Rupert Castermere had entered the room. She did not look. She finished her conversation, accepted a fresh glass from a passing tray, and allowed the natural movement of the room to eventually position them in the same general vicinity. Which it did, because rooms at London receptions have a way of creating adjacency without planning. "Dorothea," he stopped at an appropriate social distance. He looked well enough tired in the specific way of a man who has been working rather than simply worrying, which was, she thought, an improvement. "You look well." "Thank you." A pause. He was choosing words again, that careful selecting she had noticed on the steps of Hartwell's. It suited him better than the easy confidence had. And she found that observation neither comforting nor painful, simply accurate. I thought," he stopped. "Tried again. "I thought you made life smaller because you were always speaking of consequences." She looked at him steadily. "Consequences arrive whether we speak of them or not. I know that now." He met her eyes. The east wing roof arrived in August, specifically. The drainage project arrived in September. The £40,000 arrived in stages over approximately 3 months. She did not say, "I told you." She would never say that, not because she was being gracious, but because it wasn't what she wanted from the conversation. She had never wanted to be right at someone's expense. She had wanted, for 5 years, to be right alongside someone. Together before the expense arrived. "I read the March memoranda," Rupert said. "All of them. The banking alternatives, the railway investment analysis, the harvest contingency." He paused. "You saw all of it." I saw what the figures said. I told you the figures were details, he said it plainly. Without self-pity, which took a form of courage she had not expected from him. I was wrong about what details meant. I thought they were small. I didn't understand they were the structure. Everything stands on them. Or falls. And you were the one reading them. She let the words rest between them for a moment. Not to be cruel, but because they deserved the space. I never wanted you to fail, Rupert, she said. Not then. Not now, I know. He did know that was the specific pain in his expression. The knowledge that the woman he had discarded had still sent a solicitor's name when she could have let him drown. I'm not asking you to come back. I know that door is closed. He straightened slightly. I wanted you to know that I understand now what I had. I did not understand it at the time, and that is entirely my failure. And I won't ask you to carry any portion of it. She looked at this man who had stood in her drawing room 8 months ago, wearing another woman's perfume. And she felt not the wound, not the grief, but the particular clarity that comes after grief has run its full course and left behind something quieter and more durable. Thank you for saying it, she said. He nodded. He took a step back. Good evening, Dorothea. Good evening, Rupert. He moved away into the room. She stood where she was for a moment, aware of something settling in her chest, not satisfaction. Not triumph, nothing so sharp as that. Something more like the completion of a chapter. The kind of completion that doesn't require applause. Only the quiet acknowledgement that a thing has reached its natural end. She finished her champagne. She went back to Mrs. Pemberton, who had saved her a better view of the room and spent the remaining hour talking about disbursement figures. Which was exactly what she wanted to be talking about. Matthias came to Bellgrave House on a Thursday afternoon in October. Formally, with Werner walking behind him and a card sent ahead the previous day through entirely proper channels. Lord Bellgrave received him in the front drawing room, the good one. The one with the Bellgrave portraits and the writing desk that had belonged to the third Marquess. And they spoke for 40 minutes, while Dorothea waited in the morning room with her correspondence, and the particular alertness of a woman who knows something significant is occurring on the floor below. Her father came to find her when it was done. He stood in the doorway of the morning room, looking like a man who had conducted a difficult negotiation and come out the other side with something he hadn't entirely expected to feel so moved by. He asked permission to court you, Lord Bellgrave said. Formally, with marriage as the expressed intention. He paused. I told him that was your decision to make, not mine. He said he understood that and had come to me as a matter of courtesy rather than authority. He was very precise about that distinction. Dorothea set down her pen. He wants to speak with you himself, her father said. He's waiting in the front drawing room. She walked downstairs. She was aware of every step, which was unusual. She was not ordinarily a woman who counted her own footsteps. Matthias was standing at the window when she came in. Not looking at her, he had not heard her enter yet, and for a moment she watched him without his awareness, which was something she almost never permitted herself. He was looking at the street with the focused attention he brought to everything. The quality that made rooms feel like he was acting in them, rather than simply occupying space. Then he turned, and she crossed the room, and they sat. I will not ask for marriage today, he said. She waited. I am asking whether you would permit me to court you with marriage as my intention. Openly, with whatever timeline makes sense. He held her gaze with the steadiness she had known since January, the steadiness that did not waver when she disagreed with him, that did not recalibrate when she pushed back. I want there to be no ambiguity about what I am asking for. Or why. She looked at him for a long moment. He did not hesitate, because he had known the answer for some time and had simply been waiting for the right moment to say it clearly. Because when I am wrong, you tell me. Because when I am right, you do not flatter me. And because when people who need help are in the room, you never ask who will notice before you help them. He paused. Those are not small things. They are the things I cannot find anywhere else. And I have stopped pretending I am not looking for them. She sat with that answer. She turned it carefully, the way she turned documents. Looking for the inconsistency, the weakness, the gap between what a thing appeared to be and what it actually was. She found nothing that contradicted it. 8 months of Tuesday meetings. 8 months of documents with questions in the margins. 8 months of a man who changed the proposal when she was right, and told her clearly when he thought she was wrong, and walked with her to the carriage, and remembered she didn't take her tea sweet. She found nothing that contradicted it. "Yes," she said. "You may court me." Something shifted in his expression, not relief. "Exactly. But the particular quality of a man who has been careful and careful and careful, and has just learned the carefulness, was worth it." "Thank you," he said. She stood to see him out, and at the door of the drawing room she stopped. "Matthias." She said his name without the title for the first time. And both of them registered it. He waited. "The 3 things," she said. "Asked before the decision. Truth before the consequence. Trusted before I have to prove I was right, I remember. I want you to know that I said them because I meant them. Not as a test, I know." He held her gaze. "I intend to be those things. Not because they are conditions, because they are how I want to live with someone." She nodded. He left. She stood at the drawing room window and watched his carriage pull away. And then she went upstairs to her room, closed the door, and did something she had not done since December. She sat on the edge of the bed and wept. Not from grief. From something that was harder to name than grief, and considerably more frightening. The specific terror of wanting something real after a real thing had broken. She cried until it was finished, and then she washed her face and went to find her father. Lord Bellgrave was in the library. He looked up when she came in, took one look at her carefully composed but still slightly overbright eyes, and set down his book. "I trust his judgment," she said, sitting in the chair across from him. "I do not yet trust my own heart." Her father was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, October was doing something gray and gentle with the light. "Then give him time," he said. "Not an answer, just time." She looked at her father, this man who had bumbled through her grief in December and proposed lawsuits when what she needed was silence, who had sat across from a foreign prince for 40 minutes that afternoon and come away clearly moved, who had spent 30 years doing his imperfect best by a daughter who was, in most essential respects, beyond his full understanding, but not beyond his love. "Yes," she said. "All right." What followed was 6 months that Dorothea did not know how to describe in any framework she had used before, because she had not experienced courtship as anything other than the formality that preceded a settled future. And this was not that. This was something that moved and questioned, and occasionally frustrated and frequently surprised her. And she found, with some astonishment, that she preferred it. They walked in Hyde Park on Sunday afternoons, with Werner and the Bellgrave lady's maid maintaining appropriate distance near enough for propriety, far enough to permit actual conversation. They corresponded when Matthias traveled to Edinburgh in November for a diplomatic consultation, and the letters were not brief. He wrote with the same directness he brought to the document margins questions in the text. Genuine questions, things he was actually thinking about, and wanted to know her opinion of. She wrote back at equal length. Her father found her at her desk at 11:31 Wednesday night, writing a 6-page response to a question about grain transport infrastructure, and asked no questions, just brought her a cup of tea and went back to bed. Matthias's sister, Princess Lena of Falconried, came to London in December on her own diplomatic visit, a woman of 32, with her brother's directness and a warmer social manner that had been clearly calibrated for diplomatic work. She took tea with Dorothea twice, and the second time she dismissed her own lady's maid and Werner and said, with the precision of someone who had decided to be direct and was doing it efficiently, "My brother is not easily impressed. He has been consistently impressed by you for 11 months. Which is, in my experience of him, unprecedented. I wanted you to know that I find your judgment sound and your company intelligent, which are the 2 things I care about most in the people my brother chooses." Dorothea considered her response carefully. "Are those also the things you care about in the people you choose?" Lena smiled. "Among others." A pause. "You asked a fair question." "Yes. Then I think we may be friends," Dorothea said. "I was hoping you would say that. The disagreement happened in February, and it was real." Matthias had selected a contractor for a section of the Falconried Railway reconstruction that required substantial labor in the Western District. The contractor's bid was the second lowest, which had appealed to the Budget Committee. and Matthias had reviewed the financial terms and found them sound. He had mentioned the selection in a letter to Dorothea without asking her view, which was, she noted, with a clarity she would later articulate the first time in 11 months he had not asked. She wrote back with the financial summary and appended her concern about the worker housing provisions. The contractor's bid included accommodation specifications she had seen before in the committee's labor record specifications, that on paper met the minimum legal standard for temporary worker housing and in practice meant 12 men to a room designed for 8, inadequate ventilation for winter, and a cooking facility shared between 60 workers that the committee's own dockworker records showed produced a consistent pattern of foodborne illness in close-quarter situations. She wrote, "The financial terms are sound. The worker conditions as specified will produce illness rates that slow the construction timeline and generate labor disputes. The cost saving on the bid will be recovered in delays within the first quarter." He wrote back, "The housing specifications meet the required legal standard." She wrote, "Meeting a legal standard and providing adequate conditions are not the same thing." As you know, he did not respond for 2 days, which was unusual. When he did, the letter was shorter than his letters typically ran. "I have asked the district engineer to review the accommodation specifications. I will wait for his report before making the final selection." The engineer's report came back in 10 days. It confirmed that the specifications met minimum legal requirements and noted that in the engineer's professional opinion, the arrangements would be adequate for a short-term project. It did not address the illness rate data Dorothea had referenced. Matthias sent her the report with a note. "The engineer finds the arrangements adequate. What does your data actually show?" She sent him the committee's dockworker illness records from the past 3 years, cross-referenced against accommodation specifications. With the correlation table she had constructed the previous summer while working on the disbursement model. She did not add commentary. The data said what it said. He read it. She knew he had read it because when they walked in the park the following Sunday, he was quieter than usual for the first 15 minutes. And she had learned that his quiet meant thinking rather than withdrawal. "The correlation is real," he said eventually, "but it's a correlation, not causation. The same worker populations have other shared risk factors." "Yes," she agreed. "Which is why I said the cost saving would be recovered in delays. Not that the contractor should be disqualified entirely. The choice is not between this contractor and rejection. It is between the current specifications and improved ones." He was quiet again for a moment. "What would improved specifications cost?" "I estimated approximately £400 for the Western District section. I've included a comparison in the data I sent." He looked at her. "You already estimated the cost. I thought it would be useful." "It is useful." A pause. "It is also £400 that the Budget Committee has not allocated." "I know. I thought you could argue for it more persuasively than the Budget Committee's objection can argue against it. Given that you now have the illness rate data." Something moved through his expression, the specific quality of a man realizing he has been not defeated but improved, which is a considerably more complex experience than simple defeat. "You were right about the specifications," he said. "I was right that the contractor's financial terms were sound. Both things are true. Yes, the correct outcome is improved specifications with this contractor. Not a different contractor. That is what I wrote in the first letter." "You did." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him, and he turned to look at her, not with the formal attention of meetings and document tables, but with something less guarded, something that had been building through 6 months of Sunday walks and letters and tea with his sister, and a partnership that had moved, without either of them declaring it, from professional to something that did not yet have a name but was clearly something. "I didn't ask your opinion before selecting him," he said. "No, that was a mistake." "Yes, it was," she said it simply. Because it was true, and he had said it first, and the honest response was to confirm it rather than soften it. "It won't happen again." She looked at him, not testing, genuinely reading what was in his face. The same way she read documents, looking for the gap between what a thing appeared to be and what it was. She found none. "All right," she said. They started walking again. Werner and the maid materialized from a discreet distance and fell into step at their proper remove. The £400, Matthias said after a moment. I'll take it to the budget committee Thursday. You'll need the illness rate comparison table. I'll need you to present it. He glanced at her sideways. The budget committee needs to understand, this is not my preference, it's demonstrated data. The data is yours. She considered this for exactly the length of time it took to take 3 steps on a February path in Hyde Park. Thursday, she said. What time does the committee sit? The letter from Falconreid arrived in March, and Matthias read it alone before he told anyone its contents. It had come from the Grand Duke, his brother Friedrich, who was 3 years older and considerably less patient, and who had been conducting the dynastic inquiry into the Bellgrave family with the thoroughness of a man who took the phrase due diligence as a personal philosophy. The inquiry had taken 4 months. Friedrich had commissioned a genealogical review of the Bellgrave lineage going back 3 generations, requested a financial assessment of the Marquisate's current standing, consulted with 2 members of the Grand Duchy's Advisory Council on the question of an English aristocratic marriage, and Matthias suspected, though Friedrich had not mentioned it, corresponded privately with Princess Lena, who had met Dorothea twice and whose opinions Friedrich trusted above most others. The letter was 6 pages long and concluded on the final page, in Friedrich's characteristic handwriting, the lineage is sound. The standing is appropriate, and Lena tells me, the woman has more sense than 3/4 of the men you deal with professionally. I am inclined to agree with her judgment in this case as in most others. You have my blessing. Do not waste more time than necessary. You have already spent 14 months being careful, which is probably sufficient. Matthias set the letter down. He sat with it for perhaps 10 minutes, alone in the working room where he and Dorothea had spent that first long afternoon dismantling a financial fraud, and he looked at the document boxes and the central table and the 2 chairs on opposite sides of it, and he felt something loosen in his chest that he had not realized he was holding tight. Then he called Werner. I need to borrow something from the committee's document archive, he said. The original charity charter from the January oversight review, the one Lady Dorothea drafted. Werner looked at him for a moment. The framework document, Your Highness? From the first fraud investigation? Yes. I need it returned to me by Friday. Werner wrote it down without further inquiry. Because Werner was exceptionally good at his job, and because he had been watching the Tuesday meetings for 14 months and had his own clear understanding of what was happening. The conservatory at the back of Lord Belgrave's country house in Surrey had been his wife's project, glass and ironwork, filled in February with the particular determined warmth of forced flowers and heated stone, a room that existed in defiance of the season outside it. Dorothea had loved it since childhood. She went there when she needed to think without being watched, and her father had understood this for so long that he kept it heated even in years when the household economies argued against it. Matthias had asked in his letter of the previous week whether she would receive him at the Surrey house on Saturday. Not in London, in Surrey. He had been precise about that, which told her something, and she had spent the preceding week managing her own considerable intellect's tendency to construct scenarios and then argue with them. She was in the conservatory when he arrived. She had not planned to be. She had planned to be in the front drawing room, composed, appropriately positioned, but she had come here 40 minutes early, because the front drawing room felt like a stage, and she was not interested in performing. He came through the inner door from the house, and he had something under his arm, a document portfolio. The flat kind used for archival materials. I was told you'd be here, he said. Your father mentioned the conservatory. My father has a great many opinions about where I am and why. She remained where she was standing near the central table, the forced February roses doing their determined work around her. You came to Surrey. I had something that required the right room. He set the portfolio on the table between them and opened it. Inside was the original Charity Oversight Charter, the framework document she had drafted in the weeks after the January fraud case, the one that had been submitted to the committee as the formal methodology for preventing duplicate invoicing and falsified vendor registrations. 14 pages in her own handwriting, with revisions in 2 other hands, Hargreaves's careful annotating in brown ink, and in the margins, in darker ink, with the slightly compressed letter spacing, of someone who writes quickly when he is thinking fast. Matthias's questions and corrections from the sessions when they had worked through it together. She looked at it. She looked at the two handwritings running alongside each other, down the margins her precision and his directness. The back and forth of two people who had been arguing in the most productive possible sense for 14 months. "This is the first thing we built together," Matthias said. She kept her eyes on the document. "I would like to spend the rest of my life finding out what else we can build." The conservatory was quiet around them. Outside, the February garden was doing nothing in particular. Inside, the forced roses held their positions with the patient commitment of things that had been asked to bloom against the natural order and had decided to comply. She looked up at him. "And when I disagree with you?" she asked. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the immediate predecessor to one. "I shall probably be irritated." A pause, genuine, unhurried, a pause that contained the 14 months of Tuesday meetings and document margins, and the Hartwell table, and the park walks, and the February labor dispute, and 6 pages from his brother in Falconreid, and a father who kept a conservatory heated through winter. "Then I shall listen," she had thought, in the weeks when she was managing her intellect's scenario construction, that she might need more time. She had thought she might need to say, "Let me think," or "Give me a few days." The way she had asked her father for time, instead of an answer back in October. She had thought the fear she had felt, then sitting on the edge of her bed, after she had said yes to the courtship, might return and require management. It did not return. What she felt instead was something considerably quieter, and more absolute than fear, a clarity. The specific clarity of a decision that has already been made somewhere below the level of conscious deliberation and is simply waiting to be acknowledged. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes to the question. Or yes to all of it." She held his gaze. "To the rest of our lives. To finding out what else we can build. To being irritating and being listened to in return." A beat. "Yes, Matthias." The way he let out a breath told her more than any declaration would have the long exhale of a man who has been careful for a very long time and has just been permitted to stop. He reached across the table and picked up the charity charter, and he held it for a moment, looking at the two handwritings in the margins. And then he set it down and looked at her. "May I?" She almost laughed. She did laugh quietly, the genuine kind. "You have developed an inconvenient habit of asking." "I intend to keep it then, yes," she said. "You may." He kissed her once, with the restraint and the precision of a man who has been waiting 14 months, and understands that the waiting was the point, that the patience was not the obstacle to the thing, but the making of it. It was not a brief kiss, and it was not a performative one. It was the kiss of two people who had been in the same room for a very long time, learning each other's exact dimensions, and had finally arrived at the moment when proximity and understanding could become something more. When it ended, she did not move away. She stood where she was and looked at him. And the conservatory held its warmth around them, and the forced roses continued their improbable February project. "The Eastern Railway budget," she said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon? You mentioned it in passing last week." "The revised projections. I've had some thoughts about the freight scheduling." He looked at her for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth did what it did, that specific movement that was the truest version of his smile, the one he reserved for moments he had not anticipated. "Can it wait until tomorrow?" he asked. "Probably," she said. "But I wanted you to know it was there." "I would have been surprised," he said, "if it weren't." The news moved through London society with the particular speed of information that has both a public and a private face. The formal announcement came through the proper diplomatic channels first, a communication from the Grand Duchy of Falconreid to the relevant offices. Received and acknowledged, made available to the social press, in the form of a notice that appeared in the papers on a Thursday morning in late March. His Highness Prince Matthias of Falconreid has announced his engagement to Lady Dorothea Bellgrave, daughter of the Marquess of Bellgrave. The marriage will take place in the autumn. 9 sentences, less than 50 words. It occupied 3 column inches in the paper, which was the correct amount of space for an engagement notice. And it appeared on the page with the composure of a thing that had always been inevitable. Dorothea read it at breakfast. She read it once, set the paper down, picked up her coffee, and looked at her father across the table. Lord Bellgrave was looking at his own copy of the paper with the expression of a man who is holding something very carefully in order not to show how much it means to him. "Well," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He picked up his coffee. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while. The way they had learned to do over 30 years of a household that had been reduced by one person too many and had found its own way of being whole. The private reaction was less composed and considerably more interesting. Mrs. Pemberton wrote a letter that ran to 4 pages, which was remarkable given that she was a woman who generally communicated in precise, minimal prose. 3 of the 4 pages were essentially the same sentence expressed in different arrangements. That she had known, from the moment Dorothea had returned to the committee in January of the previous year, that something was going to happen that was worth watching. The 4th page contained a specific endorsement of Prince Matthias's intelligence and character that Mrs. Pemberton noted was not something she extended often or lightly. Werner, when Matthias told him, stood straighter in the specific way of someone receiving news they had been privately expecting for months and were not going to hurt themselves by reacting to with expressive. "Congratulations, Your Highness." "Thank you, Werner. I'll begin the arrangements." He was already reaching for his ledger. The formal reception, the dress preparations, the Werner. Matthias stopped him. "One thing at a time." "Of course, Your Highness." A pause. "She'll want to review the budget for the reception." Matthias looked at him. "She will. I'll prepare 2 versions," Werner said. "So she has something to critique." It was the closest Werner had come to a joke in 14 months of service, and Matthias recognized it as the mark of genuine approval. Sabina Redmayne read the notice on the same Thursday morning, in a considerably different room. She had been in Paris for 4 months, living in the apartment of her older sister Louise, who was married to a French diplomat and who had received Sabina without questions and with the particular kindness of a woman who understands that sometimes a person needs to be somewhere else before they can understand where they belong. Paris had been good for Sabina in the way that distance is good for things that have become tangled. It had provided enough separation to see the shape of what had happened without the daily weight of its immediate context. She was not bitter, she was not ruined. She was 32 years old, intelligent, wealthy in her own right, and had spent the past 4 months discovering that Paris in autumn and winter was remarkable, that her French was better than she had realized, and that she had been, for approximately 2 years, confusing the electricity of wanting something she couldn't quite have with the substance of actually loving a person. She had wanted Rupert. She was fairly certain Rupert had wanted her. What she had loved was the version of him that existed at race meetings and opera evenings and private dinners, the Rupert who was free and charming and chose her specifically and deliberately, the Rupert for whom choosing her meant something because it was a choice made against expectation. She had not loved, had not known, had not been prepared for the Rupert who came with a leaking east wing roof and £40,000 in a compromised fund and a decade's worth of estate obligations that required someone to sit with the ledgers and care about them. She set the paper down. She thought about Lady Dorothea Bellgrave, who had always been precise, always been composed, always been the woman in the dove-gray gown with the sensible shoes who sat at the back of the dinner table doing arithmetic in her head while the rest of the room argued about horses. She thought about what it must have looked like, from the inside of that arrangement, to be reliable while someone else was exciting. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel. Reading the notice, she did not feel cheated or bitter, or the particular satisfaction of watching a rival fall. She felt unexpectedly something closer to respect for the woman who had gone back to work 11 days after the world fell apart, who had not disappeared, who had apparently saved a foreign government from financial fraud in the interim, and was now marrying a prince. Not because the prince had rescued her, but because she had met him in the course of doing work that mattered, and he had been sensible enough to recognize what she was. Sabina poured herself another coffee and wrote a letter to Louise, who was at a reception that evening, saying she might go out after all. Paris in March was very beautiful, and she had been inside long enough. She did not write to Rupert. She had said everything that needed saying at Calderwick, and he had understood it, and there was nothing additional that her letter could contribute to his situation. He would manage Calderwick. He would sell the London townhouse she had heard that through the Social Telegraph 3 months ago and reduce the racing and spend the next several years in the particular patient work of repairing what could be repaired. He would do it without her, which was the correct outcome for both of them. And she found, with some surprise, that she genuinely wished him well. She had confused desire with compatibility. She had not been alone in that confusion. And she was not going to spend the rest of her life apologizing for it. She was going to go to a reception in Paris in March, and speak excellent French, and see what happened next. Rupert Castermere read the notice at Calderwick. He had not gone to London for the season. He could not, precisely, afford the London townhouse this year. The sale was progressing through the solicitors, and the funds from it would address 2 of the 4 most urgent items on the estate repair list, which meant the season in London was a luxury that would have to be deferred. He had deferred it without significant regret. He had discovered, over the past 8 months of genuine estate management, that Calderwick was more interesting than he had given it credit for when the alternative had been Newmarket and the Opera. He read 3 column inches on a Thursday morning and sat with it for a while. He was glad for her. He examined the feeling carefully to make sure it was genuine and not the performed version, and found that it was, or was as close to genuine as a man can manage when the news in question involves the consequences of his own choices. She had built something real, with someone who had the capacity to see it. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything she had always deserved. And his failure to have been that person did not diminish the fact that someone else was. He put the paper away. He had a meeting with the estate manager at 9 about the drainage project on the North Fields, and the meeting required his full attention, and he gave it his full attention, because that was what the work required, and he had finally, 18 months too late, learned to take the work seriously. The memo he had written to himself, on a piece of estate's stationery in the estate office 3 months ago, was still in his desk drawer. He had not meant for anyone to see it. It said, in his own handwriting, she was not boring. She was looking further ahead than I was. Those are not the same thing. He left it there. He did not throw it away. The diplomatic reception at Devonshire House in April, attended by the relevant circles of London society, by several members of the diplomatic corps, and by enough of the court's social periphery to constitute an official acknowledgment, was where the engagement of Prince Matthias of Falconried and Lady Dorothea Bellgrave was formally presented to the world that had, 14 months ago, called their respective stories by very different names. Dorothea wore deep sapphire. She wore it not as a statement, but because it suited her, and she had always known it suited her, and she had stopped, somewhere in the past 14 months, apologizing internally for knowing things about herself. Matthias stood beside her with the particular ease of a man who is precisely where he intends to be, and has no need to announce it. They received the congratulations of various people, with the combined composure of 2 individuals who have spent enough time in difficult rooms to find a social reception genuinely manageable. Lord Bellgrave, standing to the side of the room, with the discreet satisfaction of a man watching something he had quietly wanted for a long time coming to its proper conclusion, spoke to no one in particular, and looked at his daughter with an expression that required no translation. Rupert Castermere was in the room. He had accepted the invitations, because declining it would have been, in its own way, a statement, and he was done making statements in directions that served primarily his own avoidance. He arrived at the edge of the relevant gathering at a moment when the room's movement brought him into proximity with Dorothea. And he stopped. Lady Dorothea, he inclined his head, correctly, with the slight additional depth that acknowledged rank, because Prince Matthias of Falconried outranked the Duke of Calderwick, and Dorothea stood beside him, and the forms of these things existed for reasons that Rupert now found considerably less irritating than he once had. Your Grace. Her voice was even warm without being personal. The voice of a woman who has completed something and is not required to perform either coldness or forgiveness, because she is simply present, which is its own complete thing. Rupert looked at her for a moment. Then, because he was a man who had learned something in the past year, even if he had learned it expensively, I hope he knows what he has. She looked at him. Not with triumph, not with coldness, not with any of the emotions that a lesser version of this moment might have generated. She looked at him with the same clear, steady attention she had always given everything. "He knows who I am," she said. "That is rather different." Rupert held her gaze for one long moment. Then he nodded the nod of a man receiving something he deserved to receive, and is managing to take it without collapsing, and moved away into the room. Matthias beside her had heard the exchange. He said nothing immediately. After a moment he turned to accept a glass from a passing tray and, in the movement, said quietly near her ear, "That was well done. I didn't do anything," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "exactly. They married in October. In a ceremony that was correct in every formal particular and warm in a way that formal ceremonies are not always managed to be." Princess Lena stood on the Falkrid side of the room with the composed satisfaction of a woman whose judgment has been confirmed. Lord Bellgrave stood on the Bellgrave side, with the slightly unfocused expression of a man whose feelings exceed what his Victorian upbringing has given him vocabulary to express, and who is managing this by looking at a fixed point on the opposite wall and breathing carefully. The ceremony was attended by the appropriate people. The flowers were correct, the music was correct, and the register, when it was signed, recorded the names in the order the law required. Matthias Friedrich Albrecht of Falkenried, Prince. Dorothea Eliza Bellgrave, daughter of the Marquess of Bellgrave. Beneath those names, in the spaces provided, the date, the witnesses, the officiating clergyman, a document, a record, the kind of thing that goes into archives and sits there for decades, gathering the patience of permanent things. What it did not record, because documents record facts and not the shape of what facts contain, was the 15 months between the January committee meeting and this October morning, the Tuesday tables and the freight schedules, and the conservatory proposal and the February labor dispute, and the Sunday walks, and the 6-page letter from Friedrich that began everything, and the 3-page response from Werner that confirmed a meeting time, and the 10 years before any of that, during which a woman had been carefully, precisely, invisibly building things she was never given credit for. It did not record what it felt like to be Dorothea Bellgrave on the morning of her wedding, standing in the room that her mother had loved and her father had kept heated through every February, having made freely and clearly, and with her full intelligence engaged, the most important decision of her life. Documents don't record that. People carry it instead. The reception afterward ran long in the way of events that are genuinely enjoyed rather than merely attended. By the time the last guests had departed and the house had settled into its post-event quiet, it was late, and Dorothea was in one of the smaller sitting rooms with the particular fatigue of a woman who has been precise and present for a very long time and is now in the first moment of being permitted to stop. She was working at the heavy bracelet on her left wrist, a Falkenried piece, formal and beautiful, and after 6 hours, genuinely uncomfortable when she became aware that Matthias had come in. He stopped when he saw what she was doing, crossed the room, gently moved her hands aside and worked the clasp himself, with the focused attention he brought to everything, and removed the bracelet and set it on the table beside them. "Tired?" he asked. She looked up at him, this man who had walked into a committee meeting 15 months ago with a notebook and a diplomatic mission and the capacity, which she had not expected and could not have predicted, to look at her and see exactly what was there. "Very," she said. "Regretful?" She held his gaze. There was nothing in it she needed to examine or qualify or test for consistency. It was simply the truth, plain and full and sufficient. "No," she said. He sat beside her. He was quiet for a moment in the comfortable way of someone who knows that silence between two people who understand each other is not empty. "Good," he said, "because tomorrow I intend to ask what you think of the Eastern Railway budget." She stared at him. Then she laughed, the genuine kind, sudden and real. "Tomorrow. I married my partner today." He held her gaze, steady and warm and entirely certain of what he had chosen. "I see no reason to wait until Monday." She was still laughing when she leaned against him, and the bracelet sat on the table beside them, catching the lamplight. And outside October continued its reliable business. And Princess Dorothea of Falkenried, who had once sat on the floor of a drawing room unable to remove her hairpins, who had returned to work 11 days later, who had looked at 2 invoices with identical warehouse numbers and changed the course of her own life by being willing to see what everyone else had already decided wasn't there, laughed with her husband in a quiet room at the end of her wedding day, and felt for the first time in a very long time that the future was exactly the right size. Rupert Castermere had chosen the woman who made him feel important. Matthias of Falconreid had chosen the woman whose judgment made him better. And Dorothea, who had spent years believing that being needed was the same as being loved, had finally completely, and without any remaining doubt, understood the difference.